If you're creating a website or web application, sooner or later you're going to need some input from the user, and we use forms for that. Imagine a healthcare insurance type of web app. They may have dozens or even hundreds of inputs, or government websites, or even booking a plane ticket. In those cases, you deal with big, complicated forms, and you need a robust solution for that. And one of those robust solutions is called React Hook Form. So in this video, we're going to look at how that works, including with Zalt for validation and including server-side validation. But before we do that, let's just start looking at a normal form without any additional stuff, so without React Hook Form. So I just have a simple form here. It has an input for the email, it has an input for the password, and then also an input for confirming the password, and then a submit button. So right now these inputs are so-called uncontrolled inputs, meaning if I type here, it will work. We can actually see text, but this is not coming from React state. These inputs just have their own internal state in the browser. So we are not controlling it, therefore we call it uncontrolled. Typically in the real world, people do often make these controlled inputs. So here you would create a state variable, for example, for email, two more for passwords and set password and confirm password. But when you use these React hooks, that's only possible in client components. So I'm going to convert this into a client component, right? I have separate videos on next.js. I also have a whole course about React and next.js. And then we want to make sure that this email value is actually coming from the state here. So not its internal state like now. We actually want to make sure it comes from this state here. So we're going to say value is email. Same for the password, confirm passwords. So what we need to do is whenever we type here, we do need to update the state. So that means we're going to add an onChange listener, put in. Same for password and same for confirm passwords. Now these inputs are so-called controlled inputs because we are keeping track, we are controlling the input values ourselves. The main benefit of doing this is that we have one source of truth. We always know where the values of the inputs are now coming from. So I put in some gibberish right now. If I now try to submit the form, we actually already get a warning message here. We're telling the browser this input field needs to be an email. So the browser already offers us actually pretty sophisticated client-side form validation. So let's actually use that. We are using type as email and type as password here, but there are other things as well. For example, we can specify that required should be true, so we cannot leave it empty. And actually in JSX, if you have a boolean like this, you don't need to write is true. Just specifying it will automatically make it true. So if I save here, and now if I remove this, I leave it empty and I try to submit, we actually also get a warning. Let's do that for the other fields as well. So I will add required for those as well. And there are other ones as well. For example, maybe the password needs to be at least 10 characters long. We can also specify a maximum length. Let's say the email can be at most 50 characters long. So I will just type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I now try to submit, you can see we get this warning from the browser. So let me remove these. All right, so now we just have some very basic validation. If I try to submit, you can see it tries to submit the form. And by default, it actually tries to submit it to some URL that you specify in the action attribute. Now, typically we want to submit it with our own JavaScript. So you would do something like on submit, right? And then maybe a function called handle submit. And then we can do it inline here or extract it into a separate function, usually called handle submit. So then here we get access to the event object, and here we will send the data to our server. So I get a warning from TypeScript here because it doesn't know what type this is. That's the downside of extracting it into a separate function. If I would just do it inline like this, TypeScript can already infer what this event object is going to be because it has the context here. Here I'm just defining a separate function, right? I could be using that anywhere. It doesn't know that this is connected to this on submit. So it doesn't know what this type is going to be, but here it knows the type. So here you need to specify the type. Now I don't know what the type is going to be. So what I can do here is I just hover this and I can see it's going to be some React form event. So I can just copy this, type this like that. So typically you're going to see e.prevent default. If I save here and now type out the form with some gibberish, but still conforming to the validation, you can see when I submit now, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't refresh. Basically nothing is happening now. The form also doesn't get reset. So now we have prevented the default behavior essentially when the form is submitted. So now we can do it ourselves. So here's where we would send it to the server, right? To do submit to server, let's say, right? So then we would have our code for doing that. We'll look at how to do this later in the video. Let's continue with doing some other typical things here. So typically we also want to keep track of the submitting state. So while it's being submitted, while we're sending it to the server, it should be disabled. Now typically you would create a whole separate useState variable for this. So we could do something like is submitting. Initially it's false, but once we have clicked submit, we want to set it to true. And then after we submitted it to the server, we can set it to false again. So then we can use is submitting submitting to show like a loading spinner, just some loading indicator essentially. For now, I will just use it to disable the button so the user cannot accidentally submit it twice. So we can say disabled should be true if is submitting is true. And then I can use tailwind here. I can target the disabled state to make it a gray color. So now what's going to happen is this is going to run very fast because we're not actually submitting it to a server. So let me just mock a server call. So I can use async await here, and I will just quickly create basically like a sleeper expression here. So it will just sleep for 1 second and then it will continue here. Right, so make sure you've mastered JavaScript itself as well. I have a whole course on that. So now if I just try to submit something, now if I try to submit, you can see it becomes gray for 1 second because the submitting is true. So it makes it disabled. And with Tailwind, we can easily style that like that. And then after 1 second, we set it to false again. Besides the submitting state, you should also have an error state. So there could be errors. So we could have errors, set errors. There could be multiple errors, right? Maybe there's something wrong with both the email field as well as the password field. So typically this is going to be an array. When you use a primitive value for the initial value for the useState calls, TypeScript will properly infer the type. Because we have an empty string here, TypeScript will properly infer this as a string. However, when you're using an array or object, that's not the case. So here it infers errors to be some array with never. Well, that's not true. An error is just going to be a string, and we have an array of strings. So we need to properly type this ourselves. So we're going to type this as an array of strings. So I can do it like that, right? So you could also do this manually here, but it's not necessary, right? And then string here, that's not necessary. TypeScript can properly infer that, but not with arrays and objects. So when do we have an error here? Well, for example, when the passwords are not equal. So before we actually submit it to the server, we want to have some more validation here. And specifically, we want to make sure that the password is equal to the confirmed password. It's not really easy to do that here with the native HTML validation. So we have to write our own JavaScript here. So here I get some suggestions, which I will accept. And we actually also want to return out of the function here. Right, so if there's an error, we don't want to continue and submit it to the server. We want to return here. User needs to fix it first before we actually submit it to the server. We also want to set submitting to false again. Right, so you can already see it's starting to get a little bit more complicated now because you can easily forget this, for example. All right, so then we have the errors, but then of course we also want to display them to the user. That's another issue. And how can we easily do that? So that's already a problem now because ideally if there is a password issue, we can display it right below the password field, right? But we just have an array of strings. So this would already require quite a bit of programming to get a nice structure here so we can properly match it with the appropriate input, right? So we're not going to do that here because this is just a bit too much work. React hook form will make that much easier for us, but let's continue here. So let's say we do have some errors. We'll just have one place where we're just going to output all of them, right? So if that array of errors is actually not empty, we do want to display some error on the page. So here what we can do is we can have a list of those errors. So for each error, we're going to have an li, right? So now if I try to submit something, I say this password is 123 and this one is 1234, so they're not equal. So now we get this error message here because here it's setting the errors, so the state changes, and here we render errors on the page. One last thing we want to do here very typically is also reset the form. So let me refresh here. So after we submitted it to the server, we want to make sure that it's empty again. It's a bit annoying to do that now because we have 3 states here. So we would have to do set email, it's going to be an empty string, password an empty string. They're all empty strings. So now if we don't make a mistake and everything is actually correct, now if I try to submit, you can see after 1 second, actually everything gets reset. This is an example of a very typical form, and look at how much boilerplate we have to write. We have all these use states here. We have this whole handle submit with e.prevent default, loading state, error state, and it already starts to get a bit tricky as soon as you need to do something that's outside the normal HTML validation, such as making sure that one field is equal to another field. Very easy to make mistakes. For example, we can easily forget to use set is submitting to false here. It's annoying to deal with errors. It doesn't have the right structure, so it's difficult for us to match the errors now to the actual fields that were errored. So this right now is not a robust solution, especially again, if you're working with large complex forms with dozens of inputs, with very strict requirements for safety and accessibility. So the most popular solution for this right now is React hook form. You can see it's been growing pretty substantially and it solves a lot of those problems. Now there are other libraries as well, like for example Formic, but it hasn't been growing as fast. Some people claim it's not being maintained properly. So this seems to be the go-to solution these days. So let's take a look at how we can implement this with and without Zod. So first we'll look at without, and then we'll talk about why we even need Zod. So they show an example here. The main hook that you can import is useForm, and you can invoke it, and what you get is register, handle, submit, and then also form state from which you can get the errors. So we have to register each input, apply validation. So it's using the HTML validation. So it tries to mimic the HTML standard for form validation. So it also has required min max, the length, but that will look familiar to us, right? So now we're going to do validation through React Hook Form. The other benefits of React Hook Form is that it's very low in size because it doesn't use any dependencies, and it's also very performant, which is really important if you have a large form. And the reason it's so performant compared to what we were doing right now is because it doesn't re-render every time you type. So we had a controlled form. All our inputs were controlled. That means if you type something, you can see it all re-renders on every keystroke, because on every keystroke you have that on change updating the state. So the state changes on every keystroke, which will re-render the whole component, including its child components. However, with React Hook Form, if you're typing an input, you can see the child components here do not re-render every time, right? So it minimizes the amount of re-renders. This is actually really important if you have a large, complicated form. It's also really fast at first mounting the form in the first place, and has other optimizations as well. So let's try achieving the same, but now with React Hook Form. React Hook Form will make a massive difference, and I'll show you a before and after once we have implemented it. So I created a new file now, and now it's with React Hook Form. I just duplicated it, and let's actually install it first. So I'm going to say npm install React Hook Form. All right, so it's installed now. Now what we can do is import the use form hook, which is the main hook that you want to use. And then we can remove all of this and replace it with a use form hook. And what we get from this hook is the following. So we can destructure that. So we get a bunch of things here. So we can register every input. We can handle the submit. We need error state and loading state. So we get that with form state. Here I get errors, but we also want is submitting. We can destructure that. Right. So in JavaScript, we are destructuring form state here, but it itself is also an object. So we can destructure errors and is submitting from there. And I get red squiggly line here because I'm already using handle submit. So I'm going to remove all of this actually. We actually get a reset function as well. And we also want to check if the password is equal to confirm password. So we will use get values for that. All right, so we have this. I'm going to remove this errors stuff that we did here because we now have a much better solution for that. Now we also don't want to have the value anymore. We don't have to keep track of this ourselves. We don't have controlled inputs anymore, so we don't have to set the state ourselves with on change, so we can remove that value and on change. I still have disabled here, but let's just start from a clean slate. And we have on submit here. Let me also remove that. So now if I save here, we have a clean slate. Now let's try implementing the same with what we get from React Hook Form. So first you want to register every input. So React Hook Form can keep track of it. So what you can do here is you can call the register function that we get here, and we can give it a name. So this is going to be for email. Now when you call this function, it will actually return props. We want to spread the props on this input. So you can use the spread operators. So whatever is returned from here, we immediately spread that on this input. Let's also register the other inputs. So we have password and confirm passwords. We then also want to do validation here in this register function call. So I can say it should be required, for example. And actually I still had required here from the native HTML validation. Let's just remove that and let's do everything through React Hook Form. I can say required and then with a custom error message. So I will just say email is required. And it's the same as with the HTML validation. So you also have min length, right? And then you can say the value minimum 5 and then a custom error message, right? You have max length. All of that works the same as with HTML validation, but it's nice that you can immediately also give a custom error message. So for email, let's just make it required and nothing else. For the password here, let's make it also required, but also let's give it a minimum value. So minimum length of, let's say 10, and with a message, password must be at least 10 characters. And here we will just make this required. So now we have validation actually in place. So now let's see what happens if I just fill this out with some gibberish. If I click submit here, you can see we actually get the same behavior as initially. The browser tries to submit it. So let's properly take care of the submitting here. We don't want to have a refresh or anything like that. So on this on submit event, this time we're actually going to use the handle submit function from React Hook Form. So we want to call that function. This function will immediately prevent that default. So e.prevent default. So what we were doing here before, React Hook Form already does that for us. And then it gives us the data here, but only if the data validated. So it will do prevent default, but also immediately validate the data according to what we put in here. If it's not validated, it will not give us the value here. So once we do get the value here, we can be rest assured the data has been validated properly. We can write it in inline like here, but typically people do also extract this into a separate function. And a typical name for that is just onSubmit that we can then define here, onSubmit. So we get data. So here we want to send it to the server. We can just mock it for now with just a 1 second waiting here. Let's make this async. Okay, so I get a TypeScript issue here. So data is implicitly an any type. Typically you don't want to use any types in your code. Well, how do we know what type is this going to be? Well, remember, because we have extracted this into a separate function, TypeScript does not know. But if you do it inline like here, TypeScript can know better. So here we see data is going to be of type field values. So let me type this as field values as well. So I will put this back here. This is a type that we get from React Hook form as well. So I will just import that as well. So let me import type field values from React Hook form, or just like this. And this is just telling us it's going to be an object with, pretty much any string and any value for that. So this is basically the same as any, or very similar to any. To really properly type this, we will use Zot. So now we have to accept that data isn't going to be typed very nicely. So while it's submitting, we want to give feedback to the user, and we don't have to create state. We already get is submitting here from use form. So we can just use is submitting. We can go to our button here to disable that. Disabled is submitting. So now if I save here and I submit this, and now click submit, it actually doesn't allow me to submit this because I don't have at least 10 characters for the password. So let me just type this. Now if I submit here, you can see it is indeed submitting. All right, what about resetting the form after submitting? Well, we also get reset from React Hook form. We don't have to do that ourselves. We just call reset. So if I save here, and now if I try to submit this, you can see it's submitting, and then after that immediately resets the form. And what about errors? What if we have that error where we don't have enough characters? How do we deal with that? Well, React Hook form actually gives us the errors here. And the structure is really nice because for every field, it will just have a key in that object. So below each input, very granularly, we can output a very specific error message. So below the email input, for example, we can just check if that errors object has an email property in there. And if that's true, we can just output an error message, just a paragraph, and make it red text. We can use the message property in there. And I can do the same for the other inputs. So here for password, for example, if there is an error, we can use errors.password.password.message. And let's also do the last one here, errors.confirm password. All right, so now let's try submitting this with just some dummy data. So now I have like 6 characters. That's not enough. So now if I try to submit this, you can see we get a very nice error message here, right? So dealing with errors is much easier now. If I fix this to more than 10 characters, it doesn't have to match right now. We'll fix that in a second. But now you can see we don't get an error and it properly resets, right? So now we have pretty much everything we want. So now we actually also want to make sure that the password is the same as confirm password. And we don't have to write any additional logic here in our onSubmit. We can write it immediately here with the other validation. So here, what you can also do, if you have more complicated validation, you have the validate option here, where you get the actual value from that input. And here you can say this value is strictly equal to the password value. So this field, if that's true, we won't see anything, but if that's false, it will immediately return passwords must match. So this will just create another error, right? So this is connected to this errors.confirm password, right? So if I do some test here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then something completely different. Now if I submit here, you can see we see an error message, passwords must match. So it's really nice because it's nice that here, if you validate it and there is actually a problem here, it's immediately connected to errors.confirm password. So the structure of the errors is just much better. So if we compare this with the previous version, so here I don't even need to use state myself anymore. I can just remove that whole import. If we now compare this with what we had before, you can see before we had basically like a Frankenstein here of use state, prevent default, setter calls, some more additional logic for validation randomly here in our handle submit. But now you can see we don't even have one use state ourselves. We get everything here from use form. And our onSubmit logic is now much leaner. And the additional validation is properly connected now with the rest of the validation. The errors are much better structured. We get the loading states very easily like this. We can easily reset here. We can easily get values. And in here we get data only if it's properly validated. So if it's not properly validated, we don't get the data here. So once we get the data here, we can safely submit it to the server. And if it doesn't properly validate, it will just give us errors, which we can then properly deal with, like what we've done here, right? So before and after, you can see we had this ugly errors stuff here. And yeah, this is just much cleaner, much better, a much more robust solution. Now, what's wrong with this? Why do we need even more stuff? Why do we need Zot? And there are other ones as well, like Yup. These are all tools to help us build a schema and validate that schema. Zot seems to be the most popular one right now, so that's what we're going to use, but they all work very similarly. But why do we want to use that? Now, the most important reason actually to use something like Zod is because we don't only want to have validation on the client side, we may also want to have validation on the server side. So we are validating this form here on the client, but then when we get the data on the server, we basically want to do it again, because you cannot really trust anything coming from the client on the server. But the validation is going to stay the same. The schema, we can create one schema with Zod and use it on both the client as well on the server. If we use React Hook form alone, well, that's just a form on the client. So all the validation here that we're doing with required and min length, this is all just within this form here on the client. But we want to do the same validation also on the server and maybe other places. Maybe we want to put this in local storage. And then when a user comes back again, we want to pull it out of local storage again. When you pull something out of local storage, it's also a good idea to validate that what you get out of it is actually the correct shape. So basically, whenever you have a boundary, like a network boundary between client and server, or local storage where when you can put something in local storage or out of local storage, file system, whenever you have a boundary like that and you're getting data in your app, you want to have validation. And with React Hook form, we only have client-side validation here with the form. So with Zod, we can create one schema and use it everywhere. So we'll have one source of truth for how our data is supposed to be. And then we can connect that Zod schema to React Hook form. So we're not going to use this React Hook form validation. We're going to use Zod validation, but we can still connect it to React Hook form. So all of this will still work. So if there is an error with validation, it will just work with errors. All right, so I have duplicated our file once again, and now we're going to add Zod to the mix. So let's install Zod. We're going to say npm install Zod. Now Zod is its own separate thing, but we want to connect it to React Hook form here because we still want to use all of these features from React Hook form. So to do that, we need a so-called resolver. React Hook form also offers resolvers for YUP and these other schema validators. So that's from @hook form resolvers. So I'm going to install both of them. All right, so I installed that. All right, so let's actually import that here. We only need Z from Zod, and then we can create a schema. So basically the shape of the form here. And we want to use it not only here on the client side, also in other places potentially. So we're just going to have a, let's say, sign up schema. And we can say it's going to be an object. So we say z.object. And what properties will it have? Well, it's going to have an email, and that should be a string, and specifically an email. It should also have a password. It's also going to be a string. And then we can say it should have at least 10 characters, right? So if we look here, we are now doing that with React Hook form. React Hook form is using min length, value 10. And then we can also pass a custom error message. We can do the same with Zod. So here we can say the minimum should be 10. And then you can pass a second argument where you can pass the custom message, right? So we're basically going to do all of that validation now, not with React Hook form, but with Zod. And it should also have a confirm password. So now we have the validation centralized in one place, right? So not only on the client do we want to make sure that the email is required, also in the server. Just the fact that we added the email here will already make it required, right? So now we can remove it from React Hook form. And the only thing we need to do with React Hook form now is just register these inputs. So here with the password, where we say password is required, we don't want to do that with React Hook form. We want to put that in our schema because we want to do the same thing in other places as well, not just here in the form on the client. All right, so then here we can also remove this. So here we also had a required, and then we were also checking if it's the same value as the password here. We can do the same with Zod. So let's remove this. So now we're only using React Hook form here for registering, not for validation. Everything else stays the same. Is submitting, errors, handle submit, on submit, all of this stays the same. But now we have our schema, our validation centralized in one place, one source of truth that we can then use in other places as well. So how do we do that? With confirming that this password is the same as this one in Zod. Well, in Zod, you get a refine method. So after object here, we get all the data of the form here, and we can just check if data.password is going to be the same as data.confirmPassword. Now, when that's not the case, we do want to show an error. We need to connect that to some field here. Here we were using the confirm password. So here to connect that with Zod, we do need a second option here, and that's going to be a message. Passwords must match, but then we also want to connect it to some field. So in Zod you use path for that. And then it's actually an array because it could be connected to multiple inputs, but here we only want it for confirmed passwords. All right, so this is Zod. This is not connected to React Hook form yet. So now how do we connect this with all the validation now to this form? Well, when you invoke this use form hook, you can specify some options here. And we can have a resolver, and specifically it's going to be the Zod resolver. So we can import that from that @hook form, and then you can have multiple schemas. You can also have sign in schema. In a real app, you will actually have quite a few schemas. So you need to specify which schema should be used for this form. We can, by the way, also remove get values. We were using that for making sure that the passwords match, but we're doing that now here in Zod. Now we have connected Zod to our form. So now let's see if it still works the way we want it to work. So if I do test@gmail.com, and now let's say I have some passwords, but the password is not at least 10 characters. So let's see if I submit here. You can see we actually get 2 errors. The password must be at least 10 characters, that's correct. And passwords must match, right? So I just put in some gibberish here, so it's not the same. And we actually get 2 errors the way that it's supposed to work. If I fix this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So if I do the same here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now if I submit, you can see we don't get errors, everything works, everything is resetting, everything still works the way it's supposed to work. So now we have one central place for all the validation here with Zod. One more thing we want to do here is we actually can create a TypeScript type out of this. And this is just a JavaScript runtime variable as it's called, but we can also create a type out of this. So we can say something like sign up schema, and we can use Zod.inver. What it will take this sign up schema and basically create a TypeScript type out of that. And why do we want that type? Well, now we can also specify what the type of the form will be. So we can use that. So I can specify that here with angled brackets. I can tell TypeScript, hey, this form is going to be of type sign up schema. Why is this beneficial? Why do we need this? Well, now, for example, if I try to register something here with the wrong name, TypeScript will tell me this is not correct because according to your schema, you only have email, password, and confirm password, not email 53. If I remove this, we don't get a warning here, right? So we add some more type safety this way. And now when the data is properly validated, TypeScript will also know that that data is going to be of that particular sign-up schema. So not field values. This is a very general, almost like any type. But now we can be more specific. So now here, if I do it inline, if I hover E now, you can see TypeScript knows now it's going to be this email, password, confirm password object, right? So here we can just type this now as our sign-up schema. Now, I don't like that this word sign-up schema is almost the same as this one, so I will add T here to indicate that this is a type. I don't usually add I or T to my interface or types, but here I think when you have a closed name, I like to add it. So let me change this name here to T sign-up schema, and here as well. I have a separate video on why you should prefer type over interface, by the way, and it's also part of my React Next.js course. All right, so now we have a pretty sophisticated setup here, and we are properly validating here with types on the client side. Now, we may want to use the exact same setup here on the server or somewhere else. So we don't necessarily want to define all of this here in the form. Let me also remove this now. It makes sense to put this in its own file. And typically in your app, you do want to have some kind of library folder with utilities. And one of the things you also want to have there is a file for the types that you want to use in your app. It makes sense that you also put the schema of Zod in there. So let's just copy this, remove it from this file, and put that in here. I do need to import Zod here. So let me grab this from here and let me add that here. All right, so now we also need to export this so we can use it in other files. Export, and now we can just import that here. So let me import this. All right, so now it should work. We should not get any errors. Indeed, everything is working again. There's one more thing we have to do here, which is actually submit it to the server. And then if the server returns errors, we also want to output that on the page. So we sort of need to integrate React Hook form here with any server errors. And we can use our Zod schema on the server as well. So let's quickly implement some server-side functionality as well. So I'm using the new next.js app router here. And in there, we can just create an API. And this will be, let's say, the sign up route. So then you can create a route file. And here, since it will be a post request, right, because we're signing up somebody, so that's going to be a post request. We want to add something to the user's resource in the database. So here we get request of type request. We want to be able to submit the data to this route, and then we can extract the data. Here the body, we can say await request.json, and then we're going to validate that. So this is where we're going to send the data to. So let's actually try doing that. So now we can actually send it, not just mocking it. So we can use fetch, and we want to await that. And the route is going to be /API/signup. Right, so this will send the data to this route here. So then we can grab the data from body here. And now we want to validate this again on the server because you cannot really trust anything coming from the client. And by default, TypeScript actually types this as any. We actually want to type this as unknown because we don't know what it's going to be, or at least we have to assume we don't know what it's going to be. So now we can use our Zod schema that we already created. We can reuse it now, right? This is our source of truth. So we can just use that sign up schema. So we can say sign up schema. I can import that. And you can do two things. You can do parse The alternative is to use save parse, which doesn't throw an error if there is something wrong. In that case, you can just use result. You can check if the result is successful or not. If it's not successful, we can grab some errors from Zot. Now let's actually think about what we want to do here. So here on the client, when we fetch, we get a response. So typically you want to check for the OK property. Status is not in the 200 range, so it could be 404. Now how about we actually get errors that have to do with validation? So we can just check. If it has errors, we can then use React hook form here to output those errors. So what we want to be able to do is something like this. So we can just grab the errors. There is an email property in that errors object. We can set the error in React hook form. And React hook form also gives us this function. So let's actually import this from the use form hook, set error. So here we can specify for which field there is an error. Let's say here there's an email problem. And then we just want to grab the message, right? So this is basically what we want to be able to do here on the client. I'm going to comment out the reset here because this reset will immediately remove the errors as well. Okay, so now we can go to our route. If we parse this according to our schema and there are errors. So what we can do here, we go over each issue that was found during parsing, and we actually get a good suggestion here from Copilot. So now for each issue, we're creating this object, and then we can send that to the client. We can check if this object is empty or not. So we can do that with object.keys, Zot errors. So basically it creates an array of every key. If the length of that is more than 0, it means there was an error. So if that is true, we will send an object with errors being the Zot errors, and otherwise there was no problem. So we will send an object with success is true. Don't worry if something is not clear. Okay, so now how do we test this? And maybe here we make a mistake. So here we make some random number here. So now if I type this out according to the validation rules, so it will pass the client-side validation, so we get the data here. So now if I submit here, let's see what we get. So it's going to take a second, and we actually see an error message now coming from the server. It's saying something like expected string, received number. And that's because here, of course, we are passing a number here, and it should be a string. Check out my React Next.js course if you really want to become a professional React Next.js developer. In any case, make sure you've mastered the underlying fundamentals, both JavaScript as well as CSS. I have courses on them both. Check out the links in the description. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.